Welcome to the Creative Life Story Work podcast, where we explore how a creative approach to life story work can help children and young people who have been in care make sense of their past and build a brighter future. A new model for life story work is being rolled out in the northeast of England, and this podcast shares the latest learning and investigates how it could help improve the lives of care-experienced children and young people across the country. My name is Dawn Williams and I am an associate at Blue Cabin, one of the partners on the exciting work. Today we are asking the question, how can we best support children and young people on the More About Me pathway in creative life story work? Discussing it with me today are Lynda Gallagher, a very experienced therapeutic life story worker, and Professor Richard Rose from Therapeutic Life Story Work International. Definitely the right experts to have in the room. Welcome, Lynda. Lovely to see you this morning.
Thank you.
And welcome, Richard. Lovely to see you again.
Hello, Dawn. Nice to see you. Hi, Lynda.
Really lovely to have both of you in the room today to be thinking about more about me. And just, I wondered, Richard, if you could set the scene for people who are listening today to understand the difference between All About Me, which we've talked about in previous podcasts, and the difference as to why some children are put into the More About Me part of this programme.
Yes, Dawn. So basically what we have, as you all know from the previous podcasts around All About Me and Creative All About Me, that's really capturing the now, capturing the view of the child in their world that they exist in, about what their interests are, what they see as their kind of friendship groups, where they live. But for some young people, knowing the present doesn't really help them to make sense of their past. And so their past may often define them. And so in the Creative Life Story Work project, we have All About Me Direct, All About Me Creative. Then we have this More About Me we're going to talk about today. And then for those very much more challenging situations and those children that may be suffering in a much, much more kind of impactful way, we have Therapeutic Life Story Work. But More About Me is really where we're working with young people to help them understand how they got to where they've got to and the reasons why they live where they live. So it's very, very useful when we're working with young people, for instance, who might not live with their family of origin or may live within a connected care situation or in a foster placement where they're not really sure how they got there, or maybe things are happening in the world right now where they still have contact with their family of origin and curious about why they don't live with them. It's very, very helpful sometimes to do a piece of work with a young person which is targeted on a particular situation. So we use More About Me books and More About Me work for children, for instance, that may be involved in a placement with a connected carer or a special guardianship order placement, where that child may have experienced their parents in a domestic violence situation. Maybe their parents have been involved in some form of drug use, which has got in the way of them being able to care for their children in a safe way. Maybe it's young people who've been involved in witnessing particular traumas within the family of origin, which are still live for them, still drive them, still define some of their behaviours. But they're also trying to make sense of how come they now live somewhere, but they may also see these people. The other good thing around More About Me work with children is we're often working with their carers. And so if you are a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle that's caring for your child, or if you're a foster carer that's working with your young person, and you sometimes not really sure about their journey, not sure about what's happened in their kind of world, and you're working with them around behaviours or emotions or presentations that cause you concern or maybe give you reactions to your journey, then More About Me helps the parent figures and the young people involved. And finally, of course, what the idea of More About Me is to allow young people to explore that past, to explore the reasons why, but also for them to engage in relationships with the now. So we use the concept of who I am, what comes from my past that I need to make sense of so that I can then move from, and what's in my past that I want to honour and keep with me. So it's a lovely arrangement. It kind of works over 8 to 10 sessions. It starts off with getting to know the young person and their carer, and then it works in that sense of identifying those areas where the young person may be struggling. So it might be, for instance, you have a young person who has some sexual harmful behaviours. And therefore we can think around, well, where do those behaviours come from? What are those behaviours there for? And how are those behaviours maybe interrupting their opportunity for the future? And so we deal with those things once we get to know the child. And then we think around how that child then has experienced, made sense, moved forward, and how in some cases we can change those behaviours, or we can put a different view of those behaviours and the origin of those behaviours, so that in the end, hopefully, the young people can see that there is a pathway they can follow that will help them to have a healthier, a more congruent life with their carers, but also a life which actually has opportunity rather than being defined by those earlier life experiences.
What I'm hearing really loudly and clearly is about the importance of the adults in the space with the child and their carer. Lynda, I'm really delighted to be able to have you in the space today as a recent graduate of Richard's diploma course. And I wondered if you would be happy to talk about how you're applying it to your work as a therapeutic life story worker.
All About Me is very different to therapeutic life story work. As Richard explained, therapeutic life story work is done over a much longer period, and you go into far more depth of the therapeutic journey of the child. The More About Me, we focus on the here and now, or what any issues are that are going on at that time that have affected the child, maybe, as Richard explained, from the past. So we look at who they are now, where they've come from, and where we're going in the future, and how their behaviour is affecting any issues within the family at the current time. I use it very much so when I'm working with children who are placed with usually within the family unit, not with the parents. So particularly with SGOs, they can be living with grandparents or with aunties and uncles, or it's usually within that area.
When you're doing a work with the family, but because we'll have people listening to this podcast who are foster carers or kinship carers, what does it look like when there's really good adult support in place to support that child through the process? What is it that the other adults around the child can be doing to support the process that you're leading?
I always describe it as you actually see, as the relationship starts to build. I mean, you always start a session, we start a session with play and relaxation, and then we'll go into whatever work we are actually doing at that time. I get it as I say, you'll see them swinging, if that makes sense.
No, tell me more about that. What does that look like?
Oh, you can get a child who is not in the here and now, and maybe they've gone back to a trauma that's happened previously, and they can be very their emotions are coming out, but then the carer will come in, and then you'll see them swinging together and working beautifully together, and that relationship is enhanced. You see the carer supporting the child, and the child actually really wanting that support and going in there. And towards the end of that session, the child will, I call it puddle jump. A child can be in trauma very, very quickly and be within, you can be discussing a subject for 15 minutes, and then within 10 minutes, they've jumped completely out of that puddle. Children have a fantastic approach to be able to do that. I don't think adults can. And that's what I love about working on these projects, and not projects, working with these children and seeing how we support them. on the current traumas that they're going through or behaviours.
I love those examples of those moments of them being together and that support us, and the child being able to cope in a different way. But just describing that is really what I imagine would be really useful for adults to understand as well, that this is what's happening in the space where they are with you.
Yeah, when they're placed with grandparents, the grandparents know the journey, they know everything that's happened, and they can be very protective against maybe the child from if they're maternal grandparents, if the parent has, been involved in domestic abuse, drug abuse, and they just take it as very matter of fact, but they forget the child is in the middle of all this, and they're a continuous heightened, they're listening all the time, where grandparents and family members will often talk about, and it can be derogatory, not very nice what they talk about, and the child is in the middle of this all the time. So it's supporting that and supporting the parent carer very much so in that effort as well, not just the child.
I think that's right, isn't it? Because what often happens when you're doing the more about me work, as Lynda's saying, you get the puddle jumping, you get that opportunity of light bulb moments, or that resilience that you see from a child that can be in the middle of something really, really difficult, and then suddenly pop back out of that situation. And as Lynda says, it's much more difficult for us as adults. A lot of our kind of experiences keep us right down, whereas a young person, if we get the right communication, can actually start to realise something and then suddenly go, oh yeah, and then suddenly they're in a different space. But I think, carrying on from what Lynda's saying, and I completely agree with her, one of the biggest issues around more about me work we find is the impact it has on those adults that are involved in the work. Because if you look at a grandparent as an example, we work with aunties, uncles, we also work with foster carers, we also work with birth families. At the moment, for instance, I'm doing more about me work with a couple of birth families where there's been an issue around divorce, and it's been a bit difficult with the concepts of domestic violence. And as Lynda said, the child's been exposed to all these things, and therefore the child's trying to understand what's happened to daddy, what's happened to mummy. But what mummy and daddy have, and what grandparents often have, is this shame, this blame, this guilt. They carry on the kind of should have, would have, could have's. And so what we often find doing more about me work with grandparents, as an example, is that they often are absolutely mindful of, will this grandchild become like my daughter or like my son? And so they'll see little traits of behaviour that we might believe is just normal, kind of adolescence, normal kind of, I always have this comment when I work with children, our 7-year-olds, who am I? Our 11-year-olds, who am I and who are you? And our 13-year-olds, who am I and who the hell are you? And so whichever way you get to, there is a context where that child is trying to explore themselves. And as they explore themselves and they get angry, they get cross, they swear, they do things that, we all do to learn, that is sometimes a bit of a kind of a red flag, if you like, to a grandparent who thinks, they're just like my daughter, or, oh my gosh, they're just like my son, they've got to stop this. Whereas what I think we do in More About Me, hopefully, is that we actually work with grandparents and parents and, kind of connected carers to say, actually, there is this thing that we have in us which is all around exploration, but there's also this thing around us which is regret and sadness. And we'll work with your regret and sadness. We'll work with your own challenges around your own feelings about your own children, so that we can then have space for you to connect with your grandchildren. And so the best example I can give you, and I think Lynda will have loads as well, is that I once worked with a young person, and she was at school, really troubled at school, loads of difficulties, lots of sexually acting out behaviours and some, neglect. The school believed that she was not eating food, and so they referred her to CAMS because they felt that she was, had a poor relationship with food. At home, she was living with grandparents. Grandparents, lots of guilt around their daughter and how their daughter had not managed to care for their grandchild in an appropriate way. And so they would absolutely kind of pour into her lots of love, attention, gifts and food. So as an example, in the morning, she'd have a cooked breakfast with Grandad. And when she got back from school, she'd have pasta ready. And when Grandad got home, she got loads of food with Grandad. And this girl didn't want to say no to her grandparents. The trouble was, of course, that meant she's got nothing left in her to take food on when she's at school. She's absolutely full up. And so she tells school she doesn't want food. Because school don't talk to grandparents and grandparents don't talk to school because they don't want to say what's going on in each other's areas, what happens is that everything is then kind of, out of sync. Everything is really problematic. Once we do more about me work, we can bring grand to child, school to child, grand to school, and suddenly we have a team around this child which will actually see her as a whole person. And we do that not just for the child, we do that for the grandparents. We help the grandparents to see their own story, their own lives. So it's a really wonderful way of linking up the past to manage the present and then to look for the excitement of the future. And most of the people that we do more about me work with, you see this kind of weaving of attachment, if you like, that was always there, but interrupted. And I think that, when Lynda talks about, our hesitancy, if you like, as adults to puddle jump, to be able to recover quickly, I think more about me work is as much for the carers as it is for the young person.
I'm definitely hearing about the building of those relationships around the child, creating a really safe and brave place for them to have those conversations. The phrase that's coming into mind is only connect, bringing everybody together and forging those connections. Lynda, I wondered if you had a different example to the one that Richard's just described that you would like to share from your work.
I've just finished working with a little boy who was in the care of family members. However, he still did see, he still had contact with his mum, not with his dad. He'd never known his dad. However, mum would continually just let him down and fail to turn up at times. Grandparents would get very angry and call mum and say, this is how she always is, and this is what she does all the time, and this is why you are like you are, to the child. And the child is then felt to feel, this is my fault. I've been taken away from my mum. And I think children, no matter what trauma they've been through, can often, they quite often, they still love the mum. That they remember all the good things that happened when they were living at home with mum. And they rarely remember, or they park and as they hide it in a little cupboard in the head somewhere, the bad things. So it's then working with the grandparents to see, what their behaviours and impact that is having on the child. We can speak to mum separately. And I think often, as Richard said, when you speak to grandparents quite often, they go back to they've had difficult upbringings as well. And you can see that cycle that's come through the family. And that can be very hard for grandparents to see as well. However, this little boy I was working with, we worked a really close network with the school and the grandparents, and we put that team, the team around the family together for the child. And grandparents' behaviours really started to change, and that impacted on the child straight away. They started to think about what they were saying in front of the child, and that just improved. It hasn't improved mum's contact and engagement, but it's improved that relationship with the child and the grandparents. So then they can carry on to build on that, and they're remembering, continually reminding themselves of what they're saying and where they're saying it within that home. I don't know what Richard thinks about that.
Well, I think that's good observation, and I think that when you do more about me work, the primary factor, of course, is the young person we're working with, but you can always do more about me work with a parent. You could do more about me work with a grandparent. So it depends on who your kind of key individual you're aiming at. But I think for me, definitely, like with Lynda's experiences, I've done many more about me's, and if we're talking about drug misuse, for instance, and a young person I worked with doing more about me, I remember him saying to me, "I know how to do drugs, Richard, and I shouldn't." And then explained how mum would take drugs. Now, he was 8 years old. And then sort of saying things like, "I'll never take drugs." And so in that sense of that more about me work, we can actually start looking at those kind of, singular issues, but we can also make sense of a broader context of, human life and how we navigate. I think that the other thing of interest in the more about me approach is it is short. So it is only, 8 to 10 weeks. We do the first 3 weeks really, or 3 sessions, is just finding out about the story of the people we're working with. So we refer to this as walking alongside the child's world. So what Lynda had done first of all was walk alongside this little boy's world. And as she's walking alongside the world, she's seeing how the family work. So where it doesn't work, i.e. contact, and where it's sort of challenging the work in the carer space. And then once we've done those 3 sessions, we're then looking at, well, what does the child know? And so we ask the child, we do things like timelines and family trees and things like this. And when we do these timelines or family trees, we're actually looking for the narrative of the child. We're looking for the narrative of the adult. So again, I'm doing a piece of work currently where the child's narrative and the grandparent's narrative is very different. It's of the same situation, but both have different concepts. So by doing both their timelines together, we can see what do they have in common. We can see what does challenge, and then we can target that. So in the last 4 sessions, so that's another 3 to get that story told. So in our last 4 sessions, that's when we do our kind of our integrated work, where we're saying to both the young person and the carer, so what do we see here together? What do we understand together? How come behaviour is the way it is? Is that about coping? Is that about defence? Is that about learnt? Is that about desperation? But also, what other behaviours could we maybe fashion that might get us the same security, but become much more helpful to us? And the other thing about more about me, Dawn, and I think, again, Lynda, you may find this in your work, is that when we do this work, the children's larger world, so that of the school, of friendships, of being in the community, start actually to increase positively. And we believe, and I fervently believe in this concept, that what we're actually doing, if you imagine that the child, has all these stories, all these worries, all these hurts, this loss, this separation, and that preoccupies them, it builds up in their kind of awareness of self, which means that when they're operating in the current world, there's so little left to actually operate with because everything else is caught up in the past. If we can, just for a moment, help the child and their carer to actually unload that, if you like, to take that out of the child, place it into a recording process. We use wallpaper, just like in our therapeutic life story work. And as that child unloads all those thoughts and feelings and hurts and sadnesses, and the carer does the same with her or his thoughts, feelings and sadnesses, what we then have is this opportunity for preoccupation to lower, and then the occupation, i.e. the chance to live their life, to increase. And the biggest signs we see, and I'm sure Lynda sees this as well, is that children start to make friends. They start to enjoy school. They start to tell their carers that they might love them. They start to, be more mindful about their space. We see children slow down, but we also see children start to make sense of their world. And this is the wonderful thing around More About Me, because you don't need a lot of time to do this work if you've got the engagement of the carers as well.
I love the phrase that you used about walking alongside the child, and you can almost see different possibilities being created out of the work that you're doing. You've said a couple of times, Richard and Lynda, that it's a short process, 8 to 12 weeks. what happens when you hit that last session? Just, I know that we're in the All About Me, we're coming to the, when that last session happens, what happens to make the ending a good ending or a transition into another part of the creative life story work process?
The last session that we do on More About Me is normally a very kind of celebratory session. We produce a book. So the children and the carer have a book that they share, and the book is a kind of record of what we've talked about, a record of what we've resolved, a record of things that are still outstanding maybe. And then what we do is we often will have, a little bit of a kind of celebration. It might be a cake or a drink or something like that. But we plan it together. But what we also do is we, as workers, professionals, we assess, well, what else might be helpful? So we would always say All About Me books, or All About Me creative life story work, or All About Me direct, depending on which pathway, should also happen every 6 months after we finished. And what that does is that's like a caretaker to the placement. So it just says, this is the last 6 months, and this is what I've done, and this is what I've achieved, and these are the things that have gone wrong, and these are the things that have gone right. But they do that together. They kind of have that journey together. So the carer would do their own All About Me book alongside the child. So that's one thing. For some children, we might recommend a non-directive therapy. It might be that, there are areas where we feel the child might, prosper. And that might be something like art therapy or dance therapy or play therapy, or it might be equine therapy or something similar. And I would say probably about 2 in every 10 that I do would go down that road. For some children, though, sadly, there is more that we need to do. And so we might actually then go into the therapeutic life story work side, which is a lot bigger a piece of work. It's a 12-month piece of work, really. So that's 18 sessions of direct work. And in that therapeutic life story side, that might be because some of the behaviours that we've addressed still need some support. And so that could be the outcomes. But we always end celebratory, always with achievement, and always with an acknowledgement of the work that's been covered and the work that we've done together.
We always talk about endings 2 or 3 weeks before we get there as well, so they know that ending is coming. And as Richard said, looking at the family working together, carrying on that work you've done certainly for at least 6 months, or signposting on, as Richard said, to something else, especially if you're in that team around the child with school as well. So they may recommend, some more therapy at school, or something that's going on within school, or something much more therapeutic led. But it's definitely a celebration on the final one and building up to that. And I think using the wallpaper is such a fantastic tool, as the child gets the book at the end, but they get to keep the wallpaper. And I'm sure Richard does the same as me, but I, especially going through every session, and 8 to 10 weeks, it's dead easy just to keep rolling it out and keep going over and reiterating and giving the child and the carer time to process what you've done over the weeks. Even if it's just a quick snap little look at it every week, and then building up to that final session. But the final session is definitely a celebration of the little boy I've just finished. He gave me a beautiful card, and he'd wrote, in his only 9, and he'd wrote in it, "Thank you for helping me grow." And I just think that's just so special.
They're quite amazing, these children.
And on that very special story, I think we have to draw our conversation to a close. I'd like to chat on all morning. Thank you, Lynda, and thank you, Richard, for giving us such a clear insight into More About Me, what happens in your sessions, and insight into what might be next. Thank you for your time and generosity this morning. Whether you're a foster carer, someone who has experience of the care system, or you work with children and young people, we hope this episode has given you an insight into how we could make life story work better for young people. You can find out more about our show at wearebluecabin.com/podcast. and we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can record and send a direct question or message to the show via the website. Tweet us at @WeAreBlueCabin, or if you are one of the 1,500 people taking part in our Creative Life Story Work Learning Programme, you can always get in touch through the online learning platform. If you'd like to listen to future episodes, remember to subscribe wherever it is you usually get your podcasts. And if you're using Apple Podcasts, please do leave us a review, as it really helps others to find our show. Bye for now.
The Creative Life Story Work podcast is an Anya media production for Blue Cabin.